It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm in California this morning, so it is an early morning, and I'm hopeful that you won't hear too many suburban noises, but today is trash day. I was telling Kathy, so please forgive us if we hear forgive me if we hear the trash trucks in the background. They make quite a production. As you now know, my name is Becky Martin. I think I was described very skillfully by Kathy, so I won't add anything. I'll try to lead by content to give you a sense of what I am working on now. As you know, I'm going to be talking about Phoenician art today and looking at a corpus of objects we call the Phoenician Anthropoid Sarcophagi. And I can tell already from spying at the names on Zoom that some of the introduction to this corpus will be totally unnecessary for many of you, whereas others I'm less certain if you know or are familiar with these objects. So I do begin in a pretty basic way just to make sure we're all on the same footing. So as you can tell from the title of my talk, I'm interested in talking about this corpus and thinking about how scholars have interpreted its limited imagery, especially with respect to the body, gender, and hairstyles, as we'll see. Okay, we should be on the second slide. So as the name indicates, Phoenician anthropoid sarcophagi were coffins that resemble the human form. They all seem to have been made during the Achaemenid period, between around 500 and 300 BCE. Most were found in Phoenician and Punic cemeteries, the greatest number coming from the environs of the central Phoenician city-state of Sidon, including the examples seen on the screen that are now part of the Ford collection in the National Museum of Beirut. Beirut has the largest collection with over 30 sarcophagi, and another substantial one is in the Louvre, as most of you know. Most of the sarcophagi were made in stone, and most of those are in marble, like the examples you see here. The marbles that have been tested are from the Aegean, from the Cycladic island of Paros. There's a handful of other identified stones, including limestone, basalt, and gypsum, and a subgroup associated with the region of Amri in Syria that was made in terracotta. All of these objects seem to have been made for elites, and all represent bodies. They should accordingly tell us something about Phoenician funerary practices and how certain markers of identity mattered in Phoenician elite funerary art, from the physical form of the body to social markers that might convey the deceased's occupation, ethnicity, age, gender, and so forth. There's, of course, no way that a coffin alone could tell the whole story of the person buried inside of it, not least of all about their biological sex or gender identity. But for today, I'm mostly putting aside important topics like physical remains, context, and burial goods to focus on questions of imagery. Because although there's a lot of existing scholarship on their style and form, we still have a long ways to go. We still don't entirely know what we're looking at when we're looking at Phoenician anthropoid sarcophagi, why they look the way they do, or what Phoenicians were trying to say about themselves with these objects. According to the widely used criteria for identifying individuals on these sarcophagi, nearly half are thought to depict women, which creates a compelling impression of sex and gender parity in elite funerary art of Achaemenid period Phoenicia. Today, I'll argue that the assessment of gender presentation in the corpus is flawed. Interpretation has been hampered by a loose grasp of gender in Egyptian and Greek art, both of which have direct bearing on this corpus, and by a more widespread tendency to misread images of ancient bodies according to modern stereotypes. As you can infer from the detail of the sarcophagus on the screen, hairstyles seem to have been where the artists who carved these objects spent most of their image-making effort. So I think hairstyles were probably quite important to patrons and should be important to us. I'll discuss how scholarship arrived at certain gendered interpretations of hairstyles, point out some inconsistencies in traditional forensic approaches, and finally, show how new evidence has upended them, with the goal of opening novel pathways for thinking about this imagery. But first, just a little more table setting. I selected this topic for this series because it's part of a book project I'm working on about partially iconic bodies in Greek and Phoenician art. That project has case studies from each tradition, with the most important Phoenician case study being, unsurprisingly, the Anthropoid sarcophagus. Here you see two views of the same lid. In the background in its present location in Istanbul's Archaeological Museum, and at left in a photograph from the original 1892 Hamdi Reinach publication of its context, the Aya necropolis in modern Saida in the environs of ancient Sidon. From the Greek side of things, the most important case study is the Herm, a peculiar statue type so named because it's associated with the god of travel and liminality, Hermes. The example you see on the screen is a Hadrianic copy from Pergamon of the most famous Herm from antiquity, the Hermes Propylios made by Alcamenes, which, according to Pausanias, was once set up near the monumental entrance to the Athenian Acropolis, earning its ancient nickname. This Herm has many of the type's typical features. The head of the long-haired and bearded male deity sits on a pillar, and the pillar is adorned with inscriptions and an erect phallus carved in high relief. Here the inscription says, "You will recognize the fine statue by Alcamenes, the Hermes before the gates. Pergamios gave it." The inscription finishes with the maxim, "Gnothe sauton," know thyself, which is placed deliberately near the phallus, right here. In the book, I explore both the iconicity and abstraction of these two statue types, alongside the importance to their visual logic of the whole body and body fragments. Both types are invented around the same time, in the later 6th century BCE, and each is at first strongly associated with a single city-state, Sidon for the Anthropoid sarcophagus and Athens for the Herm statue. In both cases, these civic identities are transgressed in the late 6th and 5th centuries, demonstrating the broader, if still culturally specific, appeal of the sculptural types. You'll note from these carefully selected examples that the Phoenician Anthropoid sarcophagus and Greek Herm share some iconographic, formal, and stylistic qualities, notably in their representational stress on the head and in their intricate hairstyles. I argue that juxtaposing these sculpted objects and looking at them through the lens of culture contact, alongside other semi-iconic imagery, helps us understand why they look the way they do, and what special functions they served in societies where other and more fully anthropomorphic approaches to the representation of gods and people also existed. Now we can return to our main topic. We think the Sidonian habit of burial in stone coffins began with the acquisition and use of these three sarcophagi that were found in the environs of Sidon in two different cemeteries. According to their form, style, and material, which is amphibolite, they were made in Egypt during the Stayite period. They were probably acquired there around 525 BCE, when the Sidonians were supporting the campaign of the Persian king Cambyses. The sarcophagus on the left seems to have been fully finished for another occupant, while the one on the right lacked hieroglyphs when acquired. The center sarcophagus was the least fully carved when acquired, with the head and headdress only roughed out. The two on the sides of the screen at some later point had Phoenician inscriptions added to them on the lid and the feet or sides, identifying their last occupants as kings of Sidon, using the title Milk. On the left is Tabnit, and on the right Eshmenazar, usually thought to be Tabnit's son. For those of us who work in southern Phoenicia, Eshmenazar's lengthy inscription offers essential historical information. It records a gift to Sidon from the great king, the territory of the Sharon plain that stretches from the city of Dor south to Jaffa. Dor, Jaffa, and most other coastal towns in this area were unoccupied from at least 600 BCE, and we now understand that the Sidonian annexation of the Sharon was the key precondition for their revival, which occurred during the reign of Eshmenazar's successor, Bodestart. What this all means for our purposes is that the earliest coffins used by Sidonians were made in Sayite, Egypt, and carefully carried and buried back in Sidon. Their acquisition can be tied to the ascendancy of Sidon within the Achaemenid Empire. Although these are very clearly not likenesses of Tabnit or Eshmanazar, we can still use these Egyptian coffins to think about representational strategies. So what do they tell us? First, you'll note that although the human form dictates their overall shape and is nearly all of their visual content, the body itself isn't very articulated. We can see heads, certainly, and in Tabnit's case, the knees, but very little else. The simultaneous centering and de-emphasis of the body is deliberate. In the Egyptian corpus, we can infer that we're looking at the representation of the body of a deceased person who is wrapped tightly in a funeral shroud. That is less obvious in the Phoenician corpus, as we'll see. The appearance of the heads in the Phoenician corpus, like the example seen at center, is explained in part by their Egyptian prototypes, both the use of funeral masks on elite Egyptian mummies and the representation of masks on wooden and stone Egyptian coffins. Egyptian masks tend to show the deceased not only as youthful, but also as though still living. These images are typically described as idealized representations of the deceased, which indicates an ideal of representation that is not driven primarily by physical appearance. Instead, idealized funerary imagery can be understood as schema, conveying social status, gender roles, and so forth. In mainland Phoenicia, there's no comparable tradition of placing full-scale funerary masks on the body. Despite this critical apparent difference in funerary practice, the Phoenician sarcophagus retains the idea of showing a living face. The Phoenician body, however, seems to be shown wearing a funeral shroud, suggesting a kind of free interpretation of the body as simultaneously living and deceased. We should also pay attention to the hairstyles of the looted sarcophagi, which are long and full, pointing to an Egyptian practice that was not gender restricted, namely the wearing of wigs. Both Egyptian sarcophagi have long wigs with their hair worn behind the ears and in front of the shoulders, framing the face and conveying elite male status. There are Phoenician sarcophagi that might be wearing wigs, as well as sarcophagi where the distinction between wigs, headgear, and natural hair is blurred. In the example at center, we seem to have natural hair worn in a rough crown over the head in combination with the lower part of a clothed headdress. It's unclear if the sculptor understood what a cloth was or ever seen one, or how it would normally be worn. All three sarcophagi seen here also have the Egyptian false beard. The false beard is, of course, another status marker tied to gender roles, but not necessarily sex. Finally, both Egyptian sarcophagi are shown wearing large pectoral necklaces, while the Phoenician sarcophagus in the center is not. In sum, although these looted sarcophagi were made for Egyptian elites, we can infer that Sidonian kings were using them to elevate and articulate their roles in Sidonian society. The elements that promoted their high status would include the practice of burial in a stone coffin, which was a novelty in 6th century Sidon, perhaps with stress put on their acquisition in Egypt, and their visual schema, which seemingly conflate these Egyptian bodies with Sidonian royal ones, wearing long wigs of hair, false beards, and pectoral necklaces on mostly unarticulated bodies that are further marked with inscriptions. Egyptian coffins weren't meant to look like particular people, and the earliest use of them by Sidonian kings shares that lack of concern. Now we can take a closer look at the tradition that comes out of the Egyptian one, a sculptural type that is explicitly derived from Egyptian art and made mostly in Greek marble and perhaps by Greek craftsmen, but still uniquely Phoenician. Both examples we see here are from the Aya cemetery where Tabnit was found and are likewise now part of the Istanbul Archaeological Museum collections. The one on the left is traditionally identified as a man, and the one at center and right is identified as a woman. The Phoenician anthropoid group has many small variations, but we can use these two to point out their dominant and repeating qualities. The sarcophagus at left reminds us of their somewhat peculiar representational logic, with emphasis on the head, which shows a youthful face looking front, eyes open, and false beard, wearing the hair in a kind of rough crown over the top of the head, with the ears exposed and some kind of fabric, which looks like a partial cloth, on the shoulders. The image at center shows the two elements that make up the coffin, the lid and the lower part that is also called a tub or basin. Notice how from the side this basin shows more of the body, from the shoulder to the feet, with special emphasis on the lower half. The same sarcophagus is shown frontally at right. The hair is worn in a similar shape to the example on the left, but notice how it has been sculpted into rough locks and is also worn down in front with 3 curly strands on each side extending onto the chest area. There's no false beard on this example, but otherwise the facial features are very similar to the one on the left. Finally, both have 2 rough bosses on their backs and 2 or 4 on the sides of the lids in different positions. The purpose of these bosses is not totally clear. Perhaps they made it easier to tie the 2 halves together, so the lid and the basin together, and or to raise and lower the objects. They're sometimes just called handles in the literature, but we can't ignore their visual impact. Unlike their prototypes, neither of these examples show the deceased wearing a pectoral. They also lack lengthy inscriptions. In fact, no known Phoenician anthropoid sarcophagi have identifying inscriptions. It's possible that these features were sometimes added in paint, but at present we lack evidence of painted writing. There are remarkable shifts from Egyptian practice here to the Sidonian modification of the looted Egyptian sarcophagi to these fully Phoenician examples. Another view of the Beirut collections allows us to summarize what we think is happening in the Phoenician corpus. The anthropoid coffins show and only show the deceased, following a vague outline of the body. Rough bosses are not smoothed away, in contrast to the high degree of polish elsewhere, with the exception of textured hair. Most seem to show the body wrapped tightly in a shroud, with limited or no articulation of its form on the lid. The faces are lively, as if the deceased were still living, but we can't easily say how people understood what they were seeing. Some of the sarcophagi seem to show heads with necks, and some don't. Sometimes the head seems logically attached to an outstretched body, and other times simply emerging from the anthropoid form, and still others as though resting on or emerging from a kind of board or tubular shape. Hairstyles are varied and were clearly important since they were where most of the artist's effort was spent. We don't know if these hairstyles are representations in stone of hair or wigs, or if hairstyles worn in life or only in the grave. Likewise, we note that all the representations are youthful and were made at consistent, if not identical size, meaning we could not really use them on their own to understand the age of the deceased. Finally, I want to point out that a very few have other sculpted features, like the example in the foreground. This shows more of the body, in this case, feet and arms. Just over half a dozen sarcophagi show people holding things, a staff, flowers, fruit, or an oil vessel, and a few of the terracottas from the Amrit region are shown wearing sculpted jewelry. So to get these numbers, as well as information about distribution, I've relied on the catalog published by Katja Lemke in 2001 and the contemporary major studies by Simona Freda, published in 2000 and 2002. You might notice these now familiar friends who are on the cover of Volume 1 of Freda. I've also looked at sarcophagi that have been excavated since these major studies were published, and most of those come from southern Syria. Something like 150 sarcophagi are known at this time, most of which, as I've mentioned, come from central Phoenicia, especially Sidon. Examples with known find spots stretch along the eastern Mediterranean coast from Tartus to Gaza, while several others are found on Cyprus and a few more in Sicily, Malta, and as far west as Cadiz in Spain. Now we can really dive into the question of gender identification and representation. Let's start with 3 observations. First, as we've just seen, the sarcophagi represent their occupants in a way that was surely meaningful, but has an unclear relationship with physical likeness. Even so, sarcophagi are usually treated in the scholarship as though they're portraits of once living people. A related second point is that traditional scholarship has deemed it essential to classify these sarcophagi, the human remains inside, and the associated grave goods in terms of sex and gender. A binary of sex and gender is taken for granted in this research, which is why the false beard here is thought to identify this image of a man. And third, most interpretations of gender have been driven by ideas that are both modern and stereotypical, and that assume gender signaling was desirable and unambiguous. Of course, many people who work on gender in Phoenician material culture have noted these problems, but I find it helpful to remind ourselves of them when dealing with images that are made at or near human scale, and with a clear interest in naturalism. In other words, we have to be extra cautious when talking about art that encourages us to think of images as real people. Yet, in the literature, beards equal men. The traditional approach to the identification of women works in a similar way. In just 2 examples that I know of do we find sexual markers, namely sculpted breasts, that can support the identification. One was found in Sicily and the other in Spain, which we'll see in a few minutes. Almost all other bodies and faces are ambiguous, making the primary factor for the identification of women long hair. I'm very conscious right now of my own hair. I feel like I should have styled it better for this event, but in any case, long hair. We find long hair worn down, either all the hair or just a few strands, or worn up. Usually the long hair worn up is shown wavy or curly, and sometimes it covers the ears entirely. Looking now at a few other sarcophagi, typically identified as women, we see how things go. At left, we have long wavy hair parted in the center, worn up and tied behind the head. At center, we have a similar hairstyle to the one in the last slide, where there's a crown of hair with rough locks. And presumably, the rest of the hair was tied behind the head, except for a couple of wavy strands that are worn over the shoulder area, falling down onto the chest. At right, we have long wavy hair worn all the way down, with the ears fully covered. To give you an idea of how common these hairstyles are, using Lemke's catalog of around 130 sarcophagi, I found 19 examples total with long hair that was worn down fully or partially. I'm especially interested in that center hairstyle, the one that mixes the hair crown made of rough curls or locks arranged in rows, with some strands worn down in the front. In the major studies of the anthropoid sarcophagi, these long, rough locks and rows are often called bucolaken frisor. Can't tell if I clicked or not. Hang on 1 second, sorry. Yes, okay, bucolaken frisor. And I'll use the phrase bucolaken hairstyle to refer to this general look. This hairstyle is going to help us think more about the interpretation of gender in this corpus. But in order to really understand it, we need to briefly turn away from Phoenicia, and as you'll note, rather selfishly, back to my book project. So here we see again the copy of Alcamenes' Herm on the right, as well as another on display with it in Istanbul on the left. I show these Greek herms to make the point that bucolaken are not unique to Phoenician art, and indeed were not invented in Phoenician art. On the left example, the locks over the face are rough, while on the right, they're carved to create what are usually called snail curls. Snail curls were used to represent the hair of boys and men in the Greek Archaic period, and are deliberately retained on these later herms, along with other archaizing features. The finished nail curls of Alcamenes' herm on the right tell us that the hair of the herm on the left is unfinished. You can also see how the Alcamenes herm on the right has a few wavy strands flowing onto its front side, over the shoulder down to where the chest would be if it was carved. In profile view, we can see how the rest of his long hair flows down the back. Notice also in the profile view, the curls are a naturalistic response to a headband that pulls down and flattens the hair on the crown. The use of headbands and a naturalistic treatment of the hair is, of course, typical in Greek sculpture. Headbands and bows do sometimes appear on Phoenician sarcophagi, but not consistently, which implies some borrowing of form without understanding of or concern for the particulars. This happens elsewhere in the anthropoid corpus too, as we already saw, an Egyptian cloth that was kind of rendered like a shawl instead of a headdress. Now, I'm not making a criticism of Phoenician art by pointing out this kind of receptivity with misunderstanding or even rejection of meaning. Since the meaning of form in the source material was culturally specific, its adaptation surely was too. In Phoenician anthropoid sarcophagi, we see examples of different kinds of curls. Tight curls framing the face, as in the example in terracotta from Henri's on the left, or rough bucolaken in the examples at center and right. In fact, all but two Phoenician examples of bucolaken on stone sarcophagi are left rough. Perhaps the locks were only roughed out to create a nice surface to take paint, or perhaps the roughness itself was desirable. We don't know for sure, but rough hair texture shows up fairly often in this group, suggesting it was deliberate. In each of the examples on the screen, you'll also notice some of those rarely added indicators of sex and gender. On the left, we see a headpiece of some sort plus earrings and a necklace that recall images of females from smaller scale terracottas. In the center, we see a natural beard, and on the right, we see sculpted breasts. Here we can say with some confidence that we're looking at two women and a man. Let's take further note of those bucolaken hairstyles. When all we see are bucolaken, gender identification is split by scholars between men and women. When some strands are worn down, the sarcophagi are nearly always identified as women. Very rarely, as in these examples from Cadiz, can we be confident in this identification for other reasons. In total, I count around 15 bucolaken hairstyles on stone sarcophagi. 10 of these have been identified according to standard criteria as women. We can look at this chart to better understand how hairstyles and hair length have been used to identify women. The chart was made with reference to Lemke's catalog, plus two new discoveries from Cyprus and southern Syria. Most of these sarcophagi were identified as women because they have long hair that was worn up, and I've noted some other criteria used in the right column. You'll find 66 examples listed here, which is fully half of the sarcophagi in Lemke's study, and as I mentioned at the outset of the talk, nearly half of all known sarcophagi to date. As Lemke suggests, the Phoenician corpus thus interpreted indicates a very significant role played by women in elite funerary practices. I want to test these claims by taking a closer look at one specific iteration of the bucolaken hairstyle, what I'll call long hair with bucolaken, where the bucolaken are paired again with long hair that's worn down in the front. At the sides of this slide, we have two now familiar examples, at left from Sidon and now in Istanbul, and at right from Lebanon and now in Paris. In the center, we have a sarcophagus that's now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York that comes from the area of Kidion in Cyprus, part of that museum's Chesnola collection. Notice how the lid shapes are varied in each example, implying that different artists or workshops produced them, with the sarcophagus in Paris being a good example of when the sculptors were really uninterested in showing the form of the body. Even so, we can say that all three share a distinct and easily recognizable hairstyle. There are 5 sarcophagi total with this hairstyle, 2 from Sidon, one of which has a secure find spot. That's the example from Aya on the left. 2 come from Kidion, one of which is at center, as I just mentioned, the other of which has a more secure find spot, and we'll see in a moment. And one apparently comes from Lebanon, as I mentioned, but accounts of its exact find spot vary. Again, that's the Louvre example at right. Those that have been in collections for a while are typically dated from around 475 to 450 BCE. But the most recent find from Kidion is thought by its excavator to date to 450 to 400 BCE. So we might see some lowering of dates for this group, but I know that the downdating of the new sarcophagus has already been disputed, and in general, securing dates for this corpus is very difficult. Moving on, we see 2 further examples of this hairstyle while retaining the Istanbul sarcophagus it left for comparison. At bottom and right, so it's all of these pictures here, including my drawing, is the new find from Kidion, now in the Archaeological Museum of the Larnaca. And at top center, a fragmentary example now in Copenhagen that is said to come from Sidon. The sarcophagus from Kidion was excavated in 2008, making it the 10th anthropoid from the island that has been published. You can see in the details that it has remarkably well-preserved paint. Both of these examples of long hair with bukkelaken have remarkable additional features. The sarcophagus in Copenhagen has finished snail curls, and you might have also noticed the preserved stump of a false beard. The long hair and the false beard have led to its identification as a man in some publications, a woman in others. The new sarcophagus from Kidion, on the other hand, clearly has the same hairstyle as the others. We can also see the figure's arms and note that it's clad in a tunic, wearing clothing as opposed to a burial shroud. The wonderfully preserved polychromy shows golden hair and eyes, presumably only part of the colors once painted on the surface, as well as blue and purple borders on the fine tunic. Still more interesting is that this new Kidion sarcophagus has paint preserved on the skin of its face, purple painted flecks that are traces of a stubbly beard and mustache. So despite issues with picture rights, I hope you can get a sense of what's happening here if you haven't seen the publication previously. These are a couple of good photographs through museum glass. This one here, I hope, showing you the purple mustache on the figure's face. And then at left is a drawing I made from published photographs indicating the flecks of the purple on the cheeks, the chin, and the upper lip. The sarcophagus contained the skeleton of a young adult, aged over 25 years, that was identified by excavators as most likely a man. Although the burial was disturbed, it was associated with adjacent grave goods, including a golden necklace of beads and the heads of the Gorgon Medusa. Taken all together, we seem to have a natural, if fancifully colored beard that doesn't conflict with the interpretation of the human remains or burial goods, and which tells us that this hairstyle belongs to an image of a man. The traditional interpretation of hairstyles has been thoroughly upended by this new evidence. So what can we say now about gender representation in the anthropoid corpus? Let's start with some things that we can be pretty confident about. First, bukkelaken hairstyles represent more than one gender, and this is something we should have been aware of for quite some time. We've known that a sculpted natural beard could be paired with a version of this hairstyle since the bearded Cadiz sarcophagus was discovered in 1887. When the sarcophagus with breasts was found in the same area in 1980, the so-called Lady of Cadiz, we should have recognized its nearly identical hairstyle. With the 2008 discovery of the sarcophagus from Kidion, we have further confirmation that a more elaborate variation of a bukkelaken hairstyle could be paired with a natural beard. Second, we can infer, according to traditional binary-driven approaches, that men appear in this corpus with long hair that can be worn partially down. The idea that long hair is exclusively or mostly feminine in this corpus never should have caught on, given its obvious interaction with traditions where we find boys, men, kings, and male gods like Hermes with long hair that was sometimes worn down. Indeed, we find women and men with long hair in Greek, Egyptian, Anatolian, and Achaemenid art, just to name a few. We can infer that long hair could be part of varied gender expressions in Phoenician art as well. And now for some more novel suggestions. It does seem possible to me that all the figures shown wearing long hair with bukkulakan could be men, according to traditional forensic approaches. And building on that, maybe other bukkulakan hairstyles in which all the hair is worn up should be read as men too, with the single exception of the Lady of Cadiz. And once we entertain that possibility, maybe we need to wrestle with the idea that the imagery could be mostly of men. Given that only 2 examples show specific female sexual characteristics, it could be true that every other example made in stone shows a man. At the very least, I think the idea of gender parity, however appealing, is now deeply suspect. How can we continue to improve our interpretation of the imagery in this corpus? I think we need to take a big step back to acknowledge that most current readings of the imagery are lacking, our perception of gender presentation flawed, and our ability to use the corpus to think about the physical appearance of ancient Phoenicians limited. Accordingly, I think those scholars who continue to see gender signaling in this corpus need to be open to the idea that some of the hairstyles represent minority groups that defy gender binaries. But most of all, I want to suggest that we should also try to learn something from our confusion. We're not confronting a problem that can be neatly resolved by fine-tuning our methods of detection, because sex and gender distinctions were simply not a very important part of this imagery, as compared to, say, Palmyrene funerary art. The Phoenician Anthropoid Sarcophagi was not only mostly unconcerned with communicating gender differences, but also mostly ignores age, role, and ethnicity. I believe that the main job of these objects was to signal elite status for patrons who took all of these things for granted. However varied in small ways, notably in hairstyles, the imagery on most stone anthropoid sarcophagi conveys the idea of belonging and stresses fundamental sameness, not difference. The de-emphasis of most physical features and the surprising absence of names of families or individuals goes some way to support this reading. What seems to have mattered most was owning a stone sarcophagus, getting buried in it, and whenever possible, having it placed alongside of other sarcophagi that looked very much like it. And with that, I thank you for listening and welcome your comments and questions.